World News, the headlines this hour. President Trump visits the Washington church damaged by protesters after issuing a stark warning that he will deploy the army to end the demonstrations triggered by the death of the unarmed African-American George Floyd. Protests against police brutality are continuing in dozens of cities across the United States, including the nation's capital, Washington, where a curfew is now in place. Facebook employees have engaged in a so-called digital walkout, publicly expressing their dissatisfaction with their company's refusal to flag allegedly inflammatory posts by President Trump. Last week, Twitter took the unprecedented move of hiding a tweet from Mr. Trump, which included the lines, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," in reference to the wave of civil unrest in the US. Facebook made clear that it would not be following suit, saying it didn't believe it was its job to act as an arbiter of truth. But in the last 24 hours, Facebook employees have broken ranks with the company's leadership. One employee wrote on Twitter, "Allies, we must stand in the way of danger, not behind." Another senior employee said explicitly, "Mark Zuckerberg is wrong, and I will endeavour in the loudest possible way to change his mind." Well, I talked this through with former Facebook executive Dipayan Ghosh about the diverging paths of the two tech giants. I asked him who is right and who is wrong.
This is obviously a very complicated issue, and I think it's quite clear, actually. I think we're seeing one executive and one company stand for the interest of democracy, and the other stand for its own commercial interest. And really, I'm talking here about Twitter versus Facebook. I think Jack Dorsey and Twitter have done what's right. Speak out against hatred, against violence, against misinformation that can lead to the election rigging that we've seen in the past in the United States. And the other company has taken the more convenient approach that aligns with its business interests, and that's Facebook.
Which business interests do you mean, though? Because wouldn't you argue that the mood and the vast majority that are using, say, Facebook or Twitter are more in line with the thought process of Jack Dorsey? So then why is Mark Zuckerberg taking the other stance, which is the unpopular stance? In a sense, he probably knew he'd get backlash, didn't he?
Well, I think he knew that he would get backlash, and let's hope that that backlash continues to swell, because I think it might actually force Zuckerberg's hand in the right direction. But I think for the time being, and until and unless the public sentiment rises to such a level, it's in Facebook's commercial interest to follow this free speech perspective, because first of all, it allows the company to leave up tremendously engaging content. It doesn't force the company's hand in being against the U.S. president and potentially other world leaders. And it doesn't invite this slippery slope of regulation where governmental agencies might someday say, well, hey, you've set the line in such and such ways. Well, why don't we increase that line? And why don't we start to regulate more of your content?
So much more to discuss there. That was Dipayan Ghosh, former Facebook executive. Now, after several months, one by one, countries in Asia are emerging out of their lockdowns. In Singapore, some manufacturing and construction activity will restart today. But the economic cost of combating the pandemic has meant that millions of small businesses have struggled to survive because their customers have stayed at home. By some estimates, Asia-Pacific economies could lose close to $1 trillion in economic output. Our Asia business correspondent Karishma Vaswani looks at the companies and people behind the numbers.
Empty streets and highways, now familiar signs of an economy in lockdown. But it's left behind economic casualties. Amongst them, Modesto's, one of Singapore's best-known restaurants. For more than 20 years, it's been a place for family gatherings. But like all restaurants here in the last 2 months, there's been no dining in, and business took a hit. It's shutting down permanently at the end of June.
This was a hidden tsunami. So the first month, it went down a lot faster, and then it fell off a cliff. You know, we were down 82% in April. 82%? I mean, well, how do you even resolve or even think about that?
As countries start to reopen, the challenge will be getting people back into these empty department stores and restaurants. And some things simply won't come back. Companies that went bust, jobs that were lost. Multiply this millions of times across Asia, where small businesses are the lifeblood of these economies.
By some estimates, some Asian economies have permanently lost more than 6% of their annual growth just from lockdowns. That's around $1 trillion. Governments have also tried to help, but it's not always going to where it's most needed.
A lot of it is actually in terms of financial and liquidity support. Now that's fine in normal times, but these are not normal times. And this will only work if banks themselves have the appetite to lend this money on to businesses. And here we are particularly talking about smaller businesses who are most vulnerable to this crisis.
Small businesses like this clothing factory in Indonesia, which is one of many that's now in trouble. It used to make clothes, but in the last few months, orders have dried up. Now it's shifted to making masks instead, but staff numbers were cut in half.
Sales dropped almost 50%, so we are making masks just to survive. But we are seeing that demand dry up too, because everyone is making masks. I hope things go back to normal soon, otherwise we will struggle.
At Modesto's, orders tonight have been like the last 2 months, hardly enough to cover the costs. Many staff here don't know what they're going to do next. Lockdown was meant to protect lives, but shutting down entire economies has threatened livelihoods instead. Karishma Vaswani, BBC News, Singapore.
Well, in Germany now, gyms and bars will be allowed to reopen in several towns and cities from today as the country continues to relax its restrictions. Germany gained international recognition for the way it brought the coronavirus outbreak under control, but there are now fears it may be moving too quickly. Our Berlin correspondent Jenny Hill sent this report.
It's going to be a painful recovery. Düsseldorf's gyms open again as Germany relaxes most of its corona restrictions. I'm torn, Britta tells us. I enjoy the new freedoms, but at the same time I'm a bit scared. Maybe it was too early. Germany's cautious approach, relaxing now.
Angela Merkel continues to warn repeatedly that this country is still in the early stages of the pandemic. On a day like this, it's hard to believe it. Germany has brought its outbreak under control, but there is now an intense public debate about what happens next.
This country can still boast low infection rates, but it's early days.
Yes, I think it is too soon. Just now we're easing up too fast, we're easing up too much, so we risk a second wave. And I don't really understand why this is done so quickly, because still more than 80% of the population stand behind the federal agreements which we had some time ago.
Small but voluble, a minority demanded Angela Merkel lift restrictions. So, more significantly, did Germany's regional leaders, like Armin Laschet, who's a leading candidate to replace her when she steps down next year.
We have the health problem of the pandemic, but there's other damage. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds who couldn't go to school. Sick people who didn't get treatment because the hospitals were reserved for COVID. People in care homes got lonely. This is damage too, and it's claimed lives.
Nothing then to do with raising his political profile?
The measures we had to decide are so important, a matter of life and death. You couldn't act on a tactical basis.
Katharina's not impressed, though the relaxations meant she's seen her family for the first time in weeks.
Ich bin sehr skeptisch,
I'm very sceptical, she says. It's like tipping over a sack of potatoes.
Was geöffnet wird.
This country, praised worldwide for its initial success, feels rather fragile now. Jenny Hill, BBC News, Düsseldorf.
The British government is looking at ways to relax a 14-day quarantine for arrivals to the UK over the coming months. The proposed move comes amid signs of a rebellion among MPs concerned about the impact of the quarantine on the aviation and tourism industries, as Andy Moore reports.
The beaches of Spain, like here at Malaga, are beginning to open up. But will we be able to get to them? Spain's tourism minister says the UK's coronavirus figures will have to improve before British tourists can be welcomed back. And as well as problems at our intended destination, we'll also have to deal with 2 weeks isolation when we return. That scheme has alarmed many in the tourism industry and on the backbenches of the Conservative Party. We'll get more detail today, but the plan, which starts next week, will be reviewed every 3 weeks. One possibility to ease the quarantine is to create so-called air bridges or travel corridors to places with similar levels of infection. That might not come in the first review, but could come towards the end of July, just at the start of the school holiday in England. The UK's Test, Track and Trace programme is one of the keys to reducing levels of infection. It was launched last Thursday, but we haven't heard much about it, apart from reports of some staff having little to do. But Mr Hancock told the Downing Street press conference the vast majority of newly infected people and their contacts had been traced.
We've hired, as you know, 25,000 people to work as contact tracers, and the level of incidence of disease has come down. And so actually, we have more capacity than we need. This is a good thing.
There were 111 deaths reported yesterday in all settings, and an additional 445 deaths previously not reported where coronavirus tests were carried out in private labs. But the death rate is generally trending downwards, and Britain is beginning to open up again for business. A clear sign of that could be seen outside the 19 IKEA stores that opened up for trade yesterday. At some places, up to 1,000 people were said to be queuing patiently in socially distanced lines. Andy Moore, BBC News.
Let's remind you of our top story. President Trump has visited the Washington church damaged by protesters. His walkabout came after he issued a warning that he will deploy the army to end the widespread demonstrations across the country. They were triggered by the death in police custody of an unarmed African-American, George Floyd. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Sally Bundock BBC. And of course, we are updating our website all the time. I'll see you soon.
Hello there. It's been very wet recently.